Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Hunter Eisenhower. Hunter and I are going to be discussing the force system that he developed. And as part of this, we're going to discuss high force days and slow force days and the overall system that Hunter uses to program. There's a ton of great information and insight in here, especially if you're an athlete who is looking to learn more about their training, or if you're a strength coach or PT who works with a lot of athletes in that kind of setting. I think there's a lot to learn from here, and I really enjoyed my conversation with Hunter, and I know that you will too. Hunter, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
For people who might not be familiar with you, or maybe they haven't heard about, your backstory or some of the different work you're doing in the sports space, especially basketball, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and what you've been up to?
Yeah, so this career started for me 7 years ago as a GA. It really started for me junior, senior year of undergrad, where I kind of got introduced to this. I always thought it was going to be PT. I was going to be a physical therapist. And then I had like a lot of other, I feel like, people in the space, but I had a really good professor who was a strength coach before he was a professor. And he kind of was in my ear about it. Like, I think you would be a really good strength coach, because we had a good relationship and he kind of knew what my interests were. So that kind of opened Pandora's box. And then I went and got my master's at Minnesota State Mankato for 2 years. I was at Southeastern Louisiana. I was at UC Davis. Most recently, I was with the Sacramento Kings, and then I've been at Arizona State with men's basketball and triathlon for the last 3-ish months.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And from what I remember about you from the past there, you were telling me that you've been kind of working to develop something that you called the force system throughout your past 7-8 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's been a project over the last 7-8 years. I had a lot of time on the road last year with the Stockton and Sacramento Kings, a lot of time away from family. And two of the people that I worked with there, Zach Howe, who's the head strength coach, and Jazz Randall, who is the I don't remember his title, some big title. Shout out Jazz. They kept saying, like, you're going to spend so much time away from your family. Don't compound that by just sitting on the couch and watching TV the whole time. Like, be productive with your time, because at least if you're going to be away from your family, you're being productive and growing and learning and using the time wisely. So I bought like 13, 14 books for the season. And that was going to be one of my road trip things, was I was just going to read a ton. And I bought Force by Dan Cleather. And I think it was like the second book I read. So it was early last year, probably a year from this date or close to it. And that book kind of just like opened my eyes to deeper thinking when it came to words like strength and words like force, and rate of force development and all these different things. And because of that book and having force plates, I started to do kind of like some self experiments with different movements. And I did some like traditional trap bar deadlifts. I did some traditional rear foot elevated split squats. And then I just added different components to that. Maybe I did a drop catch. I mixed in some like depth drops. And what I saw from the force readings from the force plates was like kind of surprising to me. It shouldn't be, looking back on it and now understanding kind of like actually the force equation and mass times acceleration. But like a 66-inch depth drop, I have it written down here just so I can have some numbers for you. A 66-inch depth drop produced about 5,500 newtons of force. That 385-pound trap bar deadlift produced 2,900 newtons of force. Now, it's not just the force. Like, there's physiological things happening in the musculature whenever you're doing trap bar deadlifts and traditional movements. And I always like to put this disclaimer out there that this system is not to do away with traditional training. It's just to add an element that I think can help athletes. So that kind of like took me down this rabbit hole of like this high force concept of like, how can I expose my athletes to really high forces once they're already strong enough with traditional movements? But then I began thinking like, okay, it's not just about high forces. Like, people have to sprint and jump and stuff. So then it got into the other days of the fast force day. And then working in professional basketball, tendons became an issue. We had a system with the Kings that Jesse Green, who's now with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and again, Jasper Dow kind of came up with about loading specific tissues. And then I was thinking about that, and that kind of gave birth to the slow force day. And then just like different people I've talked to talk about like crawling and crouching and rolling and climbing and all these things that are beneficial for athletes. And then that kind of came about the human force day. So really it's 4 themes that you can kind of mix and match, and we can get into this a little bit later, but it's high force, fast force, slow force, and human force.
Gotcha. So your force system is essentially a means of programming for athletes that's based on those 4 different like buckets of force, I guess we could call it. A day that focuses on high force, a day that focuses on fast force production, a day that focuses on slow forces for more of like a tendon loading or longevity type of thing, and then a human force, which I kind of equate to more of like a general physical preparation or like a quadrant 1 kind of prep kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be what I really like and what I've messed around with. It doesn't have to be like a day. So you could take like fast force elements and do it early. Like you could do a speed complex, and then you could get in the weight room and have like a high force day. And you might even finish with some like slow force, maybe some like direct tissue loading or hypertrophy stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can layer these together depending on how you want to do it. I really like using human force stuff as a warm up. So you can layer it together, or I've also made it so it's like individual days. Like this is going to be a high force day, fast force day, depending on like how much time you have, depending on where you are in the year. But you can really manipulate it however you want and make it fit to what you need in the specific moment that you're in.
Yeah, what would lead you to like pair certain forces together? Like if you went high force, slow force in one day, or if you went fast force, slow force in a day, like what would lead you to pair certain things together over others? I guess I'll ask.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my mind goes to time constraints. If I have 5 days to train a team, I can really like dig into one theme for an entire day. But for example, if we're in this preseason period practicing a lot, we train about 3 days a week. And then when we get to the in-season period, my high-minute guys, I might only see them 1 to 2 times a week. So I can't just give them fast force stimulus the one day I see them, because they also need to be exposed to high forces, and they need to load their tendons, and they need to do some crawling and crouching, because I think that's beneficial in season. So I think it really comes down to time constraints and your goal. If you only have 1 day to work with a person, I might try to layer all these things in if I think it's important. I might leave one out depending on the time of year or what it is. But if I have 5 days, I can get creative and have 1 day be dedicated to one theme. So I would say that's the most simple way to put it. But really, like, I don't think there's one way to do it. I don't think it has to go fast, high, slow, human in a day. You could go human, slow, high, fast. Like, I think there's an argument to be said about however you want to layer it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And ultimately, it's going to come down to the case by case situation. You know, the person in front of you, how are they presenting? What are they doing? You know, what kind of sport are they playing, and so on that way. I like the kind of like breakdown of programming based on forces, though. And that's something I occasionally will play around with from a PT standpoint for long-term rehabs, right? Like if we get a late stage ACL or meniscus or something along those lines, we need to make sure that we're comfortable, you know, loading into and producing and absorbing all of these various forces. So I like the concept of programming based on force. Based on what you kind of explained initially, the high force versus fast force, your high force is more of your like force absorption or deceleration, I guess I'll say, based on the example you gave with the depth jump. And the fast force is going to be more of like a fast movement, like something more like elastic, I guess I'll say. Is that kind of how you look at those two?
Yes. The only caveat to that is on those high force days, I really like to use overcoming ISOs.
Okay.
And those don't necessarily fall into the same realm of like a drop catch or a depth drop. But you touched on like deceleration. And I think that whenever I'm thinking about how I'm going to program my speed work for a high force days, is I try to put my athletes in a position to be exposed to high deceleration loads. Because like the work by Damien Harper talks about like the ground reaction force of a deceleration versus an acceleration versus max velocity, and decelerations like a or deceleration is like, I don't remember the numbers, 5 something times body weight. Acceleration is, or max velocities, I don't know the exact numbers, but deceleration is the highest force exposure out of those three. So that high force day really is like, how can I expose my athletes to deceleration? How can I increase their deceleration reserve, which is another concept similar to the speed reserve that Damien Harper talks about. And then exactly the word, you hit the nail on the head. The word that I like to use for that fast force day is elastic. It could also be called the elastic day. And we could go into how I kind of like think about that. But if I had to use one word to describe that day, it would definitely be elastic.
Yeah, walk me through the elastic day. And in the past, you and I have discussed oscillatory reps as well. And I want to hear a little bit more about those if we can, Hunter. Like, what exactly do you mean by oscillatory reps, and how are you programming them on a fast force day?
So yeah, great question. So the fast force day for me is going to be a lot of time spent outside the weight room. And I really like to start that day barefoot with my athletes, doing some type of more extensive plyos, getting them hopping, getting them very short ground contact times, getting their feet exposed to the ground. Because I think that especially with basketball players, but really all athletes at this point, like they're always in their shoes. And this kind of goes down the neurology rabbit hole, but like the tactile system that their feet are responsible for reporting to their brain of what the ground is doing and where they're walking is just so dampened. So I think that if you can increase the efficiency and effectiveness of those inputs, you're automatically going to get better outputs. And that's kind of, to me, like the backbone of neurology. But anyways, so I really like to get in barefoot. And then I really like to do, I've implemented a lot of games in my warm-ups. So we'll play med ball tennis, or we'll play tennis ball keep away, or we'll play basketball tag. And then we'll go into what I really like using is speed complexes. So we'll hit some speed complexes, and however, there's a million ways you can do it. You can use constraints, you can use sleds, you can use lasers, however you want to kind of configure that. And then we'll spend over probably half the time outside, sprinting, playing games, jumping over things. And then when we get inside, yeah, we'll dig into some of those oscillatory reps. And how I kind of like to think about it is, one is like a tension release oscillatory. One is like what I call rapid oscillatory. And then one that, like, your previous guest, Joel Smith, kind of like got me thinking about from one of his Instagram posts was kind of like a rhythmic oscillatory. Because the first two I mentioned, I do them like very, I don't want to say rigid, because that doesn't necessarily go with the theme of the day. But for example, the tension release, an athlete might be standing at the top of a movement, let's say rear foot elevated split squat. They're going to sink down a little bit. They're going to squeeze every muscle in their body. They're going to try to relax all those muscles at the same exact time, drop a couple inches, and bounce back to the position they were in. The idea behind this is, one, the ability to relax all your muscles, because people talk about the thing that separates really good athletes from poor athletes is not the ability to turn on muscles, but it's the ability to turn off muscles. And then also, if you're able to relax everything when you bounce to the bottom, the concept or the idea is that the path or the connective tissues are then producing that movement to pop back up to the position you were in. So your connective tissues stretch and give you a little recoil. And I really think that's what elastic movement is. Then there's the rapid oscillatory, which is just going to be moving within a, 3 to 4 inch zone of up and down movements, because you're now having to contract and relax antagonist muscles. So up and down super fast. And then the last one that Joel posted about a while ago that I really, really like, that I've been doing myself, is kind of like a rhythmic oscillatory, to where you might be in like a trap bar deadlift, and you might just kind of like be bouncing in the bottom of that trap bar deadlift, not like trying to move as fast as you can or shut muscles off as fast as you can or turn them on as fast as you can, but really just like a subtle bounce. And he just talks about the like rhythm and fluidity of that movement and how powerful it can be. And I've done it myself, and I like doing them before I might go out and jump over things or try to dunk or whatever it may be. And I really like those. So those to me are like the three that I really use in program and that I really like, and some of the reasons behind it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that kind of partial rep concept, if you will, for the oscillatory as well. And I feel like that'll have so many benefits from, finding an area where an athlete is weak and really just hammering away at it. Say an athlete is really weak at the bottom half of their squat. Well, if we just squat full range of motion, we're probably not going to address that deficit. Whereas if we can hit oscillatory reps in that bottom half exclusively, we're really going to target deficits more specifically. So I'm a huge fan of that approach. And as you've been talking about your force system, I realized that it almost feels like some of these things are based on like some of the past methods that we've seen explore the force velocity curve, maybe like a contrast training or a French contrast training. It seems like the way you've kind of developed this has been based off of concepts in the past.
I would say, well, the first thing I want to say is that I wasn't trying to like reinvent the wheel with this. I think I was just thinking about systems and trying to use systems within my programming that loved them. Like first thing I ever read coming out of undergrad, triphasic training, like probably a lot of people. And I was like obsessed with it. But then I got further into my career. There was just like subtle things that I was like, I don't really love doing that. I kind of like doing this. So really, this is just my the way I kind of like built a system that makes sense in my mind. It might not make sense to anybody else, but it really helps me whenever I go into programming. So really it's just like pulling different concepts from different people. Like I didn't invent oscillatory reps. I didn't invent depth drops or overcoming ISOs. Those are all just things that I've learned along the way and kind of patched together to make this system. But to your question about the force velocity curve, funny you ask. Recently talking again with well, actually, I've just seen a lot of people post on Instagram and social media about the like quote unquote middle ground of training. And it's like, I don't know what I think about it to this point, but there's a lot of smart people that are talking about like, I don't know if you really need to train like strength, speed, strength. Maybe you just stay maximal strength and speed and hit the spectrums of it. So to say that this system was born from that, I would say I don't necessarily agree with, because to me the system is kind of trying to hit the extremes of training. So like high force would be your quote unquote like maximal strength, and then the fast force would be your speed end of the force velocity curve, and then your slow force day involves sometimes no movement at all.
Right.
And then your human force day isn't going to fall on that curve at all because you're crawling and crouching and rolling and climbing. So I would say that to me, and the way I like to think about it, and I know it doesn't really matter, but I've been like thinking about names of how I want to kind of like talk about this. And I didn't know if the force system was like the best name to kind of like encapsulate what everything or what it's all about. But another one I was thinking of was like the extreme system, because I like to work on the extremes of training, but I think that kind of sounds goofy. And then like the spectrum system, because I think that it just hits the far ends of the spectrums of training that I think makes the most difference. So really, like, now don't get me wrong, like on let's say a fast force day, you might sit in that force velocity curve in like a speed strength zone and do some like faster VBT movements. But overall, I really like to hit the far ends of the spectrum of that curve.
Yeah, I like that. So essentially the way it sounds to me is it's almost like you're finding the areas that aren't addressed in other training programs and making sure that we address those.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of like well-rounded good training programs probably do address them, but I've just always had a problem with people hanging their hat, especially in a sport like basketball or any other quarter field sport other than maybe like football, hanging their hat on like how much somebody can back squat or how much somebody can bench press. I just think there's so much more to it. And that's kind of how the high force day was born, of like, okay, once my basketball players can, whatever, trap bar deadlift 3 times body weight, am I going to help them be a better basketball player at all if they can then trap bar deadlift 3.2 times body weight? Like probably not. And there's going to be a limit in the force that I can expose them to with a traditional trap bar deadlift. So maybe I start doing drop catches with them. Maybe we start doing higher depth drops and pushing the needle of force exposures.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. my mind instantly goes to the Kenny Powers quote about, playing real sports and not being the best at exercising, because like you mentioned, that additional 10 pounds on a deadlift or 15 pounds on a squat might not mean anything from a performance standpoint. It might not mean anything from an injury prevention standpoint, but if we can mix up the stimuli a little bit and get some of those benefits, then why don't we? That concept was actually discussed heavily in the past when I had Austin Yoakum on the podcast as well. Is he was kind of saying like, look, some of these things in strength and conditioning, like, you need to go from 3.1 to 3.3x body weight on this, or 3.5 to 3.6x on this. Some of that stuff is a little overrated in people's opinions. So I think it's interesting that you bring that same thing up. How do you?
I also think the last thing I'm going to say on that is, whenever people are hanging their hat on 1 rep maxes, that's in most, let's just talk about like the power lifts, like deadlift, squat, bench. That's your concentric 1 rep max.
Yeah.
And I think that like out of all muscle actions, that's probably the least important. So like, how are you touching eccentric qualities? How are you overloading eccentric qualities? How are you overloading isometric qualities? Because if all you do is traditional eccentric to a split second isometric to a concentric rep, yeah, you are training the hell out of that concentric quality. But what are you doing to touch the eccentric quality? What are you doing to touch the isometric quality? Because again, in my eyes, I think those are more important.
Definitely. How do you take your system of training and forces and adapt it when someone's in season or out of season?
Yeah, this is kind of like the layering thing we touched on earlier, and I think it fits well here. So like when I'm off season, again, I have more days and I can see my guys 4 to 5 times a week. So I can really hit all of these days. Maybe I separate them out. And I also think about like what's most important in the time of year that we're in. So for example, if like starting in like the early off season, the season just ended, I probably don't need to expose the guys a lot or girls to high forces and fast forces. That's what they've just been doing all season on the court or field. So maybe I'm hitting some like more slow force, human force. Not to say that I'm not going to touch like high force stuff and fast force stuff, but it doesn't need to be the bulk of my program that far away, because I think that's kind of like the tip of the spear of preparing an athlete. So early off season, I might be doing a lot of human force stuff and a lot of slow force stuff to kind of just like expose them to general training and get their tendons and tissues hopefully feeling a little bit better from the beating that it took during the season. And then as you transition through the summer, now we can implement some of those things to all the way until you're like right before the preseason period when we go to a lot more practice on the court, and maybe we've gotten to the point where I'm able to give them very high force exposures. Maybe they're hitting 66-inch depth drops and 200-pound drop catches with a trap bar. And then on those fast force days, we're running flying 10s with a 20-yard build, and we're playing basketball tag in a full open court. And I think it's just kind of like the dose of what you give at that point of year. And then once you get in season, the way I like to think about it, and I think a lot of people that work in basketball think about it, is kind of just like how much time are they exposed on the court. So like, are you playing 38 minutes a night, or are you a walk-on that's just not going to see the floor? Because I think that their training can be a lot different. I need to be a lot more selective and efficient and effective with my high minute guy who is going to be playing and starting and winning and losing games for us than the red shirt who's not going to play at all during the season. So I think that for a high minute person, or a person that's playing a lot of time on the court or field, you probably, the way I think about it is I might need to give them a high force exposure just to like dose the quality, just to make sure that we're touching like quote unquote strength, and that gets into like the residuals of training. But it's like how I do it. I'm probably not going to have them dropping off 66-inch boxes like in season when they're about to play a game and they just played a game. But this is where I think overcoming ISOs are very powerful, is I've seen people with like a belt squat pull 10,000 Newtons. That's a very high exposure of force and you could say strength. And I can have somebody maybe not pull to that extent or with that intent, but they can hold handles and hit a overcoming ISO, and that's their quote unquote maximal strength exposure for the week or maybe 2 weeks. And to the same, maybe the fast force day is just used as like a potentiation. Maybe I'm doing the day before a game. Maybe we're not sprinting, but maybe we're hitting some lighter stuff, maybe some oscillatory stuff. Maybe we're doing that the morning of the game. And then I really like to dose high minute people with slow force stuff because it's just the opposite end of the spectrum of what they're doing on the court. They're getting high force exposures, they're getting fast force exposures, but I think that slow force is just going to be so different from what they're doing on the court that it can be really beneficial for them from a tissue standpoint. And then I also really like using human force stuff in the season for high minute people because again, it's all they're doing is the same, even though basketball is very dynamic and it's everything's different. No two plays the same. It's still very repetitive movement patterns. So I think that if I can expose them to different things within that human force realm, I think it can be beneficial too from potentially like an injury reduction standpoint. But then those red shirts and walk-ons, they might just be kind of like in another off-season block where I'm hitting them with high force and fast force and different days, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I like how you're splitting the programming up based on what they're doing. And in a minute, we'll chat more about that. But I love your concept, going back to the human force again, of just, I call it like expanding movement vocabulary or movement IQ. So essentially in season, like you mentioned, it doesn't matter if it's basketball or whatever sport, there's so much repetition of the same stuff over and over and over again. Like if you watch some of these guys warming up for their shots, like they're doing the same motion every shot over and over and over again. And it's so nice to get them moving in different planes and get them loading different tissues that they might not. And I really think the human force concept is really beneficial for that, echoing on your point, because it's not like we're overloading them with a 225-pound barbell in weird positions. It's just, can we move there controlled, uncontrolled? Can we break up the monotony of, hey, you always sprint down the court? Let's actually add some curvilinear stuff. Let's add some quick stops and directional change work. Because I think the minute we stop training those things to any extent is the minute we start to see that regression back towards a potential state of injury, like you mentioned. And I don't really have a citation to back that up. It's just one of those things that I think conceptually makes sense of, hey, if we aren't training something, we're going to lose our ability to do it. And then we get called to do it and we haven't done it in a while. What do we think is going to happen? Like I said a minute ago, I like how you kind of change what you're doing based on how much workload and volume someone's doing on the court at a particular time. How do you go about knowing how much to adjust? Are you testing things on a force plate? Are you doing like a vertical jump test and doing like a percentage? How do you know how much to adjust or how little to adjust?
Yeah, I'll real quick before I answer that, I'm going to go back to kind of like that last piece that you were mentioning of when I think about the human force days, I also think about like how low the training age of the athletes I get that I usually work with, because basketball, like they just play basketball. Like these guys have been playing basketball, AAU, high school basketball, and now that it's becoming so popular, like from 7th grade, they're playing multiple games a week, and like the training time that they're exposed to is very limited. So like I think that just sound traditional programming can and be extremely beneficial for somebody with that low of a training age. But I also think that they almost come into this space like broken to a certain extent, because they're just playing basketball, doing the same things on a hard court every single day. So I think that getting them out of the repetitive nature of that can be super beneficial. And I also think the last piece of this human force day that I think is really beneficial is I think that most people, when they think about programming, and maybe this is wrong, but this is how a lot of the people that I've talked to think about it. They think about squatting, hinging, pushing, pulling, maybe carrying. So like, don't get me wrong, you can cover a lot of bases with doing that. And that's how I kind of think about programming: unilateral, bilateral, all these different things. But there's still gaps missing in that thought process. And I think that the human force day kind of fills in those small gaps within a squat, hinge, push, pull program of, okay, you might squat, hinge, push, pull, but the crawling and the hanging and the rolling and the whatever else kind of exposes tissues to different angles. And I think it really just like fills in a good holistic program, because you're hitting the movement patterns that aren't typically addressed within a traditional program. But to get to your question of surrounding like monitoring, I would say that there's a couple different things that I think about. I think number one, the best way to monitor things objectively is just to see how many minutes they're playing. How many minutes so you played, somebody who played 40 minutes last night is probably going to feel a little bit differently than the person that played 9 minutes last night. We also have Connects on, so I'm able to monitor loads. We're in just practice every day mode, so like most people are getting very, very similar loads. But then during the games, we'll be able to monitor that too. But I also just think that like having a conversation with the player, after they're exposed to whatever load they're just exposed to is super beneficial, because one thing I've been messing around with early in this like preseason period is tracking RPE with the guys, because we have Connects on and I'm able to report player load, obviously. But with your first year with a system like that, like they're almost just arbitrary numbers, especially to the coaching staff, because they've never seen a 1100 accumulated acceleration load. Like that means nothing to them, because to them 5,000 could be high, or maybe 200's high, and we just went crazy at practice, So I've been tracking RPE, and it's interesting to see guys report different RPEs from very similar player loads. So I think that that's been a beneficial glimpse into kind of like the internal state of how they're doing. And I think that one beneficial thing from that is, one, you're kind of able to track preparedness, I think, because let's say somebody's exposed to 1,000 player load early in the year and they report that a 9, and they're exposed to that same 1,000 player load at the end of the preseason period and they report that a 6. Okay, well, maybe they're getting a little bit more prepared to handle those loads because they're reporting it as less strenuous. And to the same token, maybe in the preseason period, when they're feeling a little bit better early in the preseason period, they report that 1,000 as a 6. And then when we get a little bit through the year, we have that same player load of 1,000 and they report that a 9. Well, now, like, okay, we probably haven't gotten out of shape because you're practicing every day. Maybe there's like a fatigue issue. Maybe guys are feeling beat up, and now this 1,000 player load feels a little bit more difficult. And then the last piece that you kind of touched on was force plates, and force plates is something that I used with the Kings last year. Some we have here and something I'm going to dig into. And really the only thing that I will say on that is I think it's really powerful to not know the outcome of the jump in terms of like using a jump mat and seeing the jump height, but how they got to that outcome, because athletes, especially at this level, are very good compensators, and if they jump 50 centimeters, they might find a way to jump 50 centimeters, but they may have spent, I don't know, 0.2 seconds longer on the ground. And maybe that's the fatigue marker that you need to look at it as opposed to just the jump height.
Yeah, definitely. And the whole force plate conversation could be a whole separate podcast at some point, because there's a lot there. When you first open up that Excel sheet and you're hit with thousands of rows of data on single jump, it's like, where do I even begin with this? So that's an exciting conversation to have at some point. But I love your point of not how high did they go, but how did they get there? I love that breakdown, and I love the importance of the subjective as well. Ultimately, I think that the athletes know their bodies the best, because we can't feel what they feel at the end of the day. And each one of them is a little bit different and a little bit unique. And, what is challenging to one is going to be easy to the next one. And, that's just human difference at the end of the day. So I definitely think there's a lot of importance to be had about, that conversation with the athlete. Like you said, you can check the RPE, but even if it's just a simple 30 to 60 second check-in, like talk with the people in front of you, and you can get so much information. And it seems weird that we've had to bring that point up on several podcast episodes lately, but stories I hear from different athletes, different times, their coaches, their trainers, different ones, they just don't talk to them. They're like, okay, here's the workout, go. Yeah. And it's like, maybe we just stop just for a second, not for long, like give it 30 seconds, get the general feel or the vibe of the team or whatever that way. and adjust accordingly. And I think that one ability can really separate a great coach from a legendary coach. Because if you can't adjust on the fly and make modifications based on what the person in front of you needs, ultimately, I think you're going to do that person a disservice long term. In relating it to the force system, say you just keep blowing up guys and gals with a lot of high force days when in reality they're getting a ton of high force stimulus from their sport. Ultimately, I think you're doing them a disservice by overloading one end of the force system and not addressing the other end. And it might not show up, that season or the next season, but long term, I think all of these things play a role. And I think that needs to be a conversation that we all have at the end of the day, is not just how the athlete is right now, but how is the athlete going to be, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, especially, when you're talking about a pro athlete that way as well.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that makes me think about is a lot of these guys that I work with come in with some type of tendinopathy. And I played basketball, I played college basketball, and there were periods of the year where my knees were like, my patellar tendons were on fire. And to think that I would have to like drop off of a high box and land would be horrible. So I think that like I can kind of see how guys are reacting to certain things and have conversations with them based off how they're maybe like grimacing, like, whoa, is that causing, like, does that hurt? Like, are you just saying this is tough to do, or is this actually causing pain? But I think that if the fast force day, the word I think about is elastic for the slow force day. One thing that I really like to think about is kind of like therapeutic, because it might not feel therapeutic when you're holding a split squat iso for 30 seconds with some weight, but the research shows that things like that are going to be quote unquote therapeutic for tendons and for tissues. So like I try to tell my guys, so like this past weekend we practiced on Saturday and they came in after and we trained, and it was more of like a slow force emphasis, everything at a tempo. We did some specific tissue loading, we hit some isos at the end, and they're like, damn, we just practiced, we just did this lift, and now we have to hold 2 sets of split squat isos with whatever it was, 32 kilos. And I'm just like, trust me and just tell me how you feel afterwards. Like you don't have to love it during the moment, but just like trust me. And I think that we've built enough trust so far that they do it. And immediately after, like, damn, my leg is burning like crazy. But I think that even if they don't notice it in the moment when they're walking out of the weight room, potentially once they're at home and chilling for a little bit, maybe that's just like a little bit of dose that they needed for those tendons, or maybe the next morning that was just a little dose they needed for those tendons. And I think that if we can continue to hit that throughout the year, we're not going to have somebody flare up when we need to go play in March. And maybe we will, and maybe I need to dose it differently, but that's kind of like my thought process going through it.
Yeah, I love that. And ultimately, I think that's essential as well, is making sure the athletes respond well to what you're doing. And it sounds like in your case they are, because I think any strength coach or physio or whatever, anyone can crush an athlete. Anyone can go in and say, hey, look, you're going to start with 100 burpees because you're a minute late, and just leave everyone absolutely smoked. But it's not about just fatiguing them to a point of, feeling exhausted and never want to come back. It's also about making them feel better and play better. Again, I think it's funny how sometimes we forget in the sports performance world, the focus is sports performance and not just how sore you make someone after a workout. So I like to hear the fact that this has been well received by your athletes.
I think also to that point, like, I think there's something to be said about finding ways to expose your athletes to some higher forces without the psychological toll that it takes to do it. So like if I said, hey, you're going to stand with this, I don't know, for some numbers for you, I may have said these earlier, but like a 245 pound drop catch, which is getting up there heavy. Like that's, at least for me, pretty tough to do. But that was like 3,800 newtons of force when I did it. Again, the 385 pound trap bar deadlift was 2,900 newtons of force. So almost 1,000 more newtons of force exposure for that drop catch. And I think that if you were to tell somebody, hey, just drop and catch this little bit lighter weight or pick this heavy weight up off the ground, they would probably prefer the lighter weight. And to the same token, watch somebody grind through like everybody says like you got to expose people to 80% when they're at max to like maintain strength. So like watch somebody grind through like a 85% back squat and then watch them drop off a 44-inch box. And it's like, oh, got to get myself ready, like get under the bar. Okay, lock in. Like there is a psychological adaptive toll that takes on an athlete, especially in season, to like, hey, all you're going to do is pull against these pins as hard as you can for 5 seconds. I probably I probably exposed them to higher forces. The psychological toll that it took is probably a lot lower because at the end of the day, we got to keep the main thing the main thing. Like, I don't want to take all this psychological energy in the weight room when they're about to go be on the court for 2.5 hours, learning new plays, getting yelled at by coaches, having to run, trying to play with their teammates. Like, I want to just give them a dose of something. And I think the psychological toll is potentially missed. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that there's also a beneficial psychological aspect to having somebody do something very heavy and complete a lift that was a grind. But I think the time and place that you need to do that is also very specific. And I don't think in season is when you do that. Maybe going into a season and they hit whatever, they hit a bench PR or you have them hit some heavy single leg stuff and they feel good about it. Great. But it's the dose of when you give that and the psychological toll that it's taking on the athlete, even if it's not very evident in the moment.
Yeah, definitely the CNS fatigue role. And that goes back to what you talked about earlier and how the nervous system plays into this whole thing. And, what's interesting is I've noticed that when athletes are taxed very heavily from a CNS standpoint, maybe that's, maybe they got programmed Olympic lifting or deadlift 3 times a week or something that's going to demand a lot of like CNS activation for motor planning, motor unit recruitment. I noticed that they feel a lot more beat up and they are a lot less bouncy and explosive afterwards, which, like you said, there's a time and a place to load them. And I think that fatiguing the CNS to a certain point is essential in any training program. It's a different kind of force application. It's a neural force application, if you will. But if it's the kind of thing that we see decreased force output from for a short period of time, then we kind of have to ask ourselves, where's the value and benefit in that? And again, that's just me observing stuff. I haven't dug into the literature as deep as I'm sure you have on this. But it's just kind of interesting to pick up some of those observations. Have you seen some of the things?
Well, I think that like this is like the opposite of research because I'm just talking about myself. But if you were to like, if I was back in playing basketball and you made me back squat once a week and hit 80%, I would hate my life. I would be like, the amount of times I've like jacked up my back from back squatting and just like how it feels. I've never enjoyed it. I've never liked it. And if I had a strength coach that was like, hey, we have to hit 80% once a week or every other week to maintain our strength levels, it would take a subconscious toll, I think, throughout an entire season. But then if I had a strength coach that maybe just had me do overcoming isos or gave me some autonomy of a couple different movements of what I wanted to do to get those high force exposures, I think I would be in a lot better place. And now that's not to say that every athlete is going to hate doing that. Like when I worked with football, I think that a lot of them liked hitting 80%, 85% back squats like the week of a game because it made them feel strong. So I'm not saying this is a one size fit all. Every athlete's going to hate to squat, deadlift heavy in season. Every athlete's going to love overcoming isos and drop catches and depth drops. But I just think that there's room here for conversation of where you can fit these things.
Definitely. I know we're starting to run a little short on time, but I really want to hear about how you would take the force system and apply it to other sports outside of straight basketball or football. Like, how would you apply it to like a field sport, like a soccer or lacrosse, or how would you apply the force system to something more upper quarter dominant, like a baseball or softball?
It's a good question. I think that while granted I was working in basketball when I kind of like, and this is nowhere near a finished product and there's still a lot of things that I'm trying to like think about and develop and create good reasons for. But I think that really like the overarching concept of it from like a bird's eye view can really be applied anywhere. It's just how you manipulate the days and how you kind of apply things. I think that the question of upper quarter dominant sport like a baseball, that's an interesting thing because while I think that like upper extremity and especially overhead positions are extremely beneficial for basketball players because of how often they are overhead. Applying this to something like a baseball, or even like a heavily like rotational sport, I think that's another interesting comment of how you could potentially do that. And I think that it's kind of taking the framework and then finding ways to expose the upper extremities to this same concept. I have a post that I'm gonna put out today, and just touching on like an upper extremity kind of like higher force exposure, as we kind of did full kneeling overhead wall catches. So kneeling, the person's kind of like almost like you're going into a Nordic, but nobody's holding your feet and you're falling toward the wall, and then you've got to catch yourself with your arm overhead. And I think that, have I ever done that on a force plate to really see compared to whatever other overhead movement you want to do? No, but it's kind of just applying that drop catch theme to an upper extremity movement. And I have also done where I'm standing, two benches are right in front of me, and I drop and catch myself in a push-up position. Again, maybe that's kind of like an upper body depth drop. So I think that you can obviously do overcoming isos overhead and maybe an extended position with like an overhead position. So I think that there's the overarching concept, and you just fit it to your sport or whatever you're working with, but it definitely was not built or tailored around basketball. It's just like built and tailored around, again, the extremes of training. And then I think the areas that all athletes need to hit regardless of sport.
I love that. I love that. Finding ways to mix general prep with ways to hit all of those different things that just are never addressed or very rarely addressed in programs. Hunter, as we start to wrap up here, do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything else that we might have missed today as we were breaking down your force system?
Again, the caveat of this isn't trying to reinvent the wheel or create something that's, I'm not sitting here talking about this like I created drop catches, I created overcoming isos. I think this is just the packaging that helps me think about programming and my athletes the best. And if somebody else feels that this could help them or is beneficial for them, or they like how this sounds, or it fits with maybe their thought process, by all means reach out and we can chat about it, because it's still very much a work in progress for me. And I think that having conversations like this, where people are kind of like asking deeper questions, are beneficial for me too, because it gives me a different train of thought that I may not be thinking of before. And it kind of helps me like develop the system a little bit more as well. I'd also say that the last thing is, I think that as a field, especially in the basketball side of things, I think we're getting less and less fixated on like traditional power lifts. But at the end of the day, like if you're just hanging your hat on increased deadlift, bench, and squat numbers, I think that there's potential marks missed with that concept, because I just think there's so much more to athletic development than that. And people I've worked with in the past have given me crap for some of like the neurology rabbit holes I've gone down. But I just think that there's so many systems within the human body that come into play within sport, that if you're just focusing on strength, and maybe even just focusing on strength and conditioning, because that's the title of our field pretty much, I think there's just a lot of marks missed. And dig into some of those weird rabbit holes, because I've found stuff and I went down 6-month rabbit holes and it led me to implementing one different thing in a warm-up. But I think that like layering some of these new concepts are very productive in a program.
Definitely digging a little bit deeper into it there. And I guess we'll have to do another podcast in a year about this and talk about what's changed over the past year.
Hopefully it's changed a bunch, because it's definitely not a finished product, but it's helped me with my programming, kind of like implementing all the concepts that I've really pulled from and think are beneficial for athletes.
I love that. Hunter, for people who want to find out more about you or maybe listen to your podcast, where can they find you at?
Yeah, so I'd say Instagram is probably the best place to find me. I've tried to be a little bit more active on there. That's Hunter Eis_SP. Eis is EIS. And then I do have my own podcast, me and my co-host Mike Sullivan. It's called Move the Needle, the Human Performance Podcast. Relatively new. We just released our 14th episode, so we've got some stuff on there and got some stuff on the way. So If you want to check that out, feel free. Also, that's on Instagram at move_the_needle_perform.
Gotcha. We'll link to all of that in the description below too. So if you didn't quite catch that, you can check out Hunter and Move the Needle on Instagram and I think you're on Spotify and iTunes. Is that correct?
Yep.
Perfect. Hunter, really appreciate your time today, man. Thanks for your conversation on the force system.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Hey everyone, I want to take a second and tell you all about AliRx. AliRx is a at-home food sensitivity and gut health testing panel. You order online and then receive and complete your test at home for food sensitivities. You then receive a custom report online through your member portal and then receive personalized recipes and supplements that are catered to you based on your food sensitivities. If this is something that interests you, you can check out the link and description in my bio, and you can use the coupon code capital D, capital B, RAUN, capital RX, so D Brawn RX at checkout to save yourself 20%. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend, subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, and leave a review. This way we can spread knowledge and motivation and help reach more people. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.